It's easy to believe that the world is falling apart, but is it really? Is it in fact the case that we're on the brink of an apocalypse, or is humanity just going through an uncomfortable, what we might call in physics, phase transition to a new world order? Well, fortunately, there are scientists and scholars who study these things as a branch of complex systems theory. And tonight's lecturer, Peter Turchin, is one such person. So he's in the long list of positions, but he's project leader of the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna, Austria, Vienna, and a founding director of Seshat, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, which is a global history databank. He's also a research associate at the University of Oxford and emeritus professor at the University of Connecticut. And I keep trying to pronounce that the American way, and I can't do it. But I'm sure you know where it is. So he's currently investigating how it is that millions of humans can come to cooperate, and conversely, what causes formerly stable communities to suddenly fall apart. I came across his work from the gloomily titled book End Times, but there is now, I should say, another book, The Great Holocene Transformation. So is it doom soon? Well, I hope not, but I look forward to finding out this evening. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Peter Turchin.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction, Paul. You can hear me, right? This thing is working. Okay, let's put it away. Not very well.
I can't hear you very well.
Hold the mic. Ah, yes, thank you. How's this? Is this better? No. Let's see. No, wait a second. Let me just turn it around. See.
We always use the handheld mic.
And because that takes one of my arms away. Okay, no, it's still not working. Yeah. One more try. Let's see.
Above our pay grade.
Yeah.
It doesn't get
any
You're
louder.
just going to want to project. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna,
Okay.
if you
well, if I speak like this, right? I mean, yeah, I'm actually have a reasonably loud voice, so you should be able to hear me. Is this better now? Okay. All right. So 16 years ago, the scientific magazine Nature asked a bunch of scientists, including myself, to make predictions for the next decade, for the decade to 2020. And most people have written about wonderful scientific discoveries that they expect, or maybe technological advances. But I decided to take a slightly different route, because by that time I was trained as a complexity scientist. I worked in population dynamics, but by that time I switched into what we call cliodynamics. I'll talk a bit more about it later. And one of the topics that we were interested in was political stability and instability. And so I decided to stick my neck out. We had a theory which was already developed on studying past societies. And that theory made interesting predictions about what the societies that we live in, the United States, might have to experience. And so we published in January 2010 this prediction. So, of course, 10 years later, when 2020 hit the road, we decided to revisit this forecast and to see how well it has held up. All right. And so together with my colleague, Andrei Karatayev, we submitted the paper in early 2020 to PLOS ONE. And as the paper was going through the review, things really accelerated. So in the paper, first of all, we pointed out to some data on proxies for instability. So one of them is anti-government demonstrations. And as you can see, the anti-government demonstrations in a bunch of Western democratic societies have been declining by 2010. And that actually led many people, for example, Steven Pinker published a book right around 2009 talking about how violence declines and how reason is triumphing and things like that. But our data, which I will be talking about in my talk, was pointing us in a different direction. Another proxy is violent riots. Again, we see a very similar overall pattern: decline towards 2010, which made people quite optimistic, and then there was a trend reversal, and an outbreak of violence. So this data goes to 2008. Now, as our paper was working through the works at +1, then the summer of 2020 happened, and then of course on January 6th of 2021, we had a pretty traumatic experience in the United States. So I think at this point, and then since then, things have been getting more and more dire. In fact, the last month makes me really worried about our fates. I'm an optimist myself, but the recent developments are not really provide much ground for optimism. So I think that in a fairly disastrous way, this prediction actually turned out to be true. So what I want to talk about is several things. First of all, where did this forecast come from? All right. I'll talk about, because I'm a complexity scientist, I use the dynamical systems approach, and I think that it's extremely useful approach to study human societies. And this is where we'll talk about cliodynamics. So cliodynamics is essentially, comes from Clio, is the muse of history, who is pictured here. She has thrown her usual accoutrements away and is using now a computer. And that's what we are. And dynamics, of course, is the science of change. So it's really why and how and what are the causal factors driving the historical dynamics of all kinds of different characteristics of societies. And then I'll talk about two central concepts that we have developed: the wealth pump and the elite reproduction. And then towards the end, we'll talk a bit about the crisis and aftermath. And I'm also happy to, as long as you have good questions, and to answer them. All right. So first of all, I want to say that this forecast was not a prophecy where you don't know where it's coming from. It was a scientific prediction. What's a characteristic of scientific predictions? Future is essentially unpredictable, but we want to understand how the world works. And we have different theories. You have rival theories that explain how the world works. So you have many different theories for why societies go into outbreaks of political violence and sometimes outright collapse. So the question becomes, how do we distinguish between those theories? And the good old scientific method is that we extract quantitative predictions from those theories, all right, and then we test them with data. And we've done a lot of that using retrodictions, by predicting different types of societies, past societies from which the theory was developed. But of course, the strongest possible prediction is to make a prediction about future dynamics. So I had no expectation whatsoever that my forecast would be so successful, because I was expecting things will go quite differently, and that would give us a chance to learn about the limitations of theory. And of course, in many ways, things have gone differently. But so we'll be talking about that. Anyway, so the theory that on which this forecast was based, and which was to be tested by this prediction, was developed by looking at historical data. So I will be showing you a lot of time series data. I should also mention that there is a strong mathematical component or other computational models. So we use a lot of computational models, quite a lot of statistical results and things like that. Those I'm going to sweep under the rug. Just keep in mind that all that stuff is there, but I want to aim at giving you some understanding of dynamics, and that's why I will be showing a lot of time series. So when we look at instability dynamics for past societies, for France, for example, or for Roman polities from republic to the empire, what we see a very typical situation that they can go for maybe a century or so with pretty good internal order, peace and order, right? Or here, for example, but almost inevitably, and some kind of end times come. So we see these huge outbreaks of violence, and they tend to recur at 2 or 3 century intervals. All right. Also note that there is a lot of jaggedness here. You can see ups and downs. This data is resolved at 25-year intervals. So we see these 50-year cycles. Now, it turns out that our society, this is what the work I did in preparation during around 2010, is not immune from those cycles. And that's quite remarkable, because if you think about it, over the past 200 years, human societies have dramatically transformed. But still, there is, and our models have to take that into account. But we still are susceptible to the same types of things. So here, for example, if you look at the United States, there's, of course, a big outbreak during the American Revolution. And then for the next 40 years, the instability as measured by a variety of different types of instability events declined. So 1820 was actually known as the era of good feelings. But then things started to accelerate, and this is actually a forewarning sign. By 1860, we had a civil war, which is not even here, because civil war is 2 orders of magnitude larger events than any of those riots and so on. Then this spike was followed by little, but still high elevated, another spike. And then we had another era of good feelings around 1950s and 1960s, right? And a small spike in 1970s. So in the prediction of 2020 was taking into account both the structural factors, about which I will be talking about in a minute, but also this 50-year periodicity. This 50-year human dynamics of human societies are complex. There are basically 2 different engines driving it. One of them is the secular cycles, which gives you a couple hundred years characteristic periods. But on top of that, you have this father and sons cycles. I'm happy to talk about that later. And that gives you 2 generational cycles. What's notable that when structural demographic conditions are very favorable, they will suppress those spikes. That's what we see. So back in 2010, the question was, was there going to be another spike in the 2020s? And that's what we see here. So I just did recently, we have done, this is a 5-year step here. So we did it for the first half of the 20s. And we are there, we are way over this peak of late 1960s and 1970s already. Okay, so complex human societies, I argue, are dynamical systems based on, first of all, seeing these recurrent dynamics, but more importantly, we see that this secular cycle is a very fundamental dynamic. It affects not only instability, it affects population well-being and immiseration. It affects power structure, elites, and their relationships with the rest of the society. It affects also the state structures. And so that's how we approach it. I want to show you the equations, but we represent the system, the social system, a state, a polity. This is a state level system, right? Because we have In fact, the state is an actor, an agent in this web of feedbacks. But most of the population is here, and we look at a variety of indicators such as population numbers, age structure, urbanization, and so on and so forth. Then I'll talk more about elites later. This is a small proportion of the population that concentrates social power in their hands, and you also look at similar types of characteristics, all right? And then the state, which is most important things are the balance of revenues and expenditures and state legitimacy. And what we try to understand is how instability or otherwise stability emerges from all those interactions. And also instability, of course, acts on all those other components of the system. Okay, so what I'm going to do, because my time is limited, I will focus on these two components because this is where most of the action actually is. And so let's first talk about population, all right? And we are interested in things like well-being here. And then I'll talk about the elites. All right, so the first thing we note that if you look at one measure of economic well-being, which is real wages, then we see a very strange pattern here. We're looking at two different wage series, all scaled to index of 100 in 1927. And we see that both series have grown quite dramatically until, roughly speaking, late 1970s. In fact, 3.5 or even fourfold. That was the period of unprecedented affluence for the common people. And then it stopped. And in fact, during the 1980s, we see a decline, little bit break up in the 1990s, and another decline here, especially for the unskilled rates. So this was a very strange development. And in fact, many of you have seen another version because the GDP per capita continued to grow fairly well. So many of you have seen this graph where productivity of American workers, and productivity is closely related to GDP per capita. So they grow together until mid-1970s, and then they spread out, right? So what happened to all that productivity? Where did it go if it did not go to to workers, to typical workers, either unskilled or manufacturing, which is fairly, which used to be fairly favorable sector of the profession? Well, the way to look at it, I think, is to look at the ratio of GDP per capita. So we divide wage by ratio of GDP per capita. A nice thing about that is that we don't need a good measure of inflation, because once you go beyond into the 19th century, the measures of inflation become much worse. In fact, even today, there is a lot of arguments about how to, what does it mean to have a real wage? I actually have a whole chapter in my book, End Times, that Paul mentioned, dissecting it. But what we can do, we can take GDP in nominal dollars and median wage in also nominal dollars and divide one by the other. And then we can extend our time series back into the late 18th century. And so what we will see when we do that is that during the first 50 years or so, until 1830, relative wage has been growing. This means that workers were actually being paid more than they were producing. Workers were actually getting ahead of the general productivity of the society. All right. Then there was a break point, and we see this decline, stagnation, and then another one starting from 1910 or so. This is the period we looked at in the previous graph, right? Where again, workers were actually gaining ground. Workers were gaining ground and the wealthy people were losing ground. The numbers of billionaires and millionaires was declining during this period. It was the great compression. But then it did not last. There was another turning point. And then we see this decline in the relative wage. Now notice if you just superimpose the graph of instability, you will see that it's almost perfectly opposite. You have decline to 1820, increase, and then another decline to 1960 and an increase. So, this is very suspicious that there is such a dynamical correlation between those two time series. Of course, correlation is not causation, but we can actually. I'm going to put to you in a bit of abbreviated form the actual causal mechanism. So essentially, this is what I call the wealth pump. So the periods when these periods are when the wealth pump is operating in a perverse way. It's taking from the workers, from the common people, and giving it to the elites. And same thing here. But the wealth pump can operate in both directions. But when it does operate in favor of elites, right? We see the following patterns. First of all, what turns the wealth pump on? It depends on the society. The mechanisms for agrarian societies, pre-industrial societies, are somewhat different from the mechanisms that we see in developed societies. But essentially, it's there is a general explanation which has to do with what's known in sociology as the iron law of oligarchy. Essentially, after a couple of generations of integrative periods during which the social stability is high, the elites get very used to it, and they are tempted to start rejiggering the economy and society in general in favor of themselves. They sort of switch from pro-social elites to selfish elites. And when they do that, they start putting in a variety of instruments. So, for example, in the United States, the Reagan period was the very clear period when the workers had their power taken away from them as a result of attack on the labor unions. The minimum wage was not increased, and so there was no support for the poorest things. There was fairly massive immigration and movement of jobs overseas. And so all those factors, a number of economists more on the left-leaning side argue that these were conscious decisions by the economic elites to increase their profits at the expense of workers. This is somewhat controversial, but certainly the fact is that they have turned around and they have turned on the wealth pump and turned around relative wage. All right. So this operation of the wealth pump has three consequences. The first one is it results in popular immiseration. We saw that in the stagnation of real wages and the decline of relative wages. But when I'm talking about immiseration, I mean actually a pretty absolute immiseration. So here is a very famous set of data from Ann Deaton and Ann Case and Angus Deaton, the economists who have introduced the idea of the death of despair. So what we see here is that that prosperity period started, they have declined quite a lot. So let's look at the gray one, which summarizes things. And then the death of despair was at fairly low level, started growing during the 1970s. During the 1990s, they didn't grow very well. remember the real wages were actually growing through this thing. And then they really took off after 2000, all right? And there is a whole bunch of, talking about drugs and so on. I mean, there is a number of other factors affecting it. So it's not a perfect correlation, but the main driver, there's been a lot of work done. This, I was just recently reading an article dissecting the argument. It's not really despair. It turns out that the major drivers that cause suicide, alcohol abuse, and drugs is not just feelings of despair. That only if you if you have administer a psychological test and you're really down, you're only 50% more likely to commit suicide. But if you're out of work, you're 3 times more likely to commit suicide or kill yourself by alcohol. If you don't have any social connections, you're also 2.5 times more likely to commit suicide. So the actual proximate factors is not necessarily the feelings of despondency, it's the feeling of being disconnected from the rest of the society, not having families and friends, and not having other workers with whom you can socialize in the work that gives meaning to your life. But the result, but it is all driven by, ultimately it's driven by this wealth pump, which lowered the wages and increased the number of people out of the labor force, right? All right, so the other thing is when I was back in 2010 here, right? I would give similar talks like this. And I would say, okay, well, back in the pre-industrial state, you would see a huge effect on mortality and so on, because that was the Malthusian period. But now we live in the post-Malthusian period. Boy, was I wrong. In fact, in 2014, the life expectancy for Americans started to decline even before the COVID, even before the COVID shock. Now, since then, it has come up a bit, but we are still, we are just barely made up that gap, all right? And of course, comparable country averages. This is OECD countries, so economically developed liberal democracies. They had also some shocks and so on, but the gap is growing. Worse than that, this is the average life expectancy, but we'll be talking about inequality in a minute. What it hides is the huge difference between the better off and worse off. So recently, just a month ago, John Murdoch of Financial Times gave a great talk. I hope he will publish this as an article. So what he did, he was comparing he divided up the population in terms of their life expectancies into median life expectancy, right? What's been happening to the median life expectancy? Remember, median is it's not average. It's 50% cutoff. So median means that 50% of the population do worse and 50% do better. It's a much better measurement to tell us what the typical person does than the mean, because the mean is inflated by really high tails. All right, so what we see here is that this is non-English countries, by the way, because it turns out that English-speaking countries have not quite as bad a situation as US, but not quite as good as the rest of the comparable countries. So here you see pretty much the same dynamic as in the previous slide. So the median is not very different from mean here. But let's look at the two tails. So this is the 5% most short-lived. I mean, the United States was not great even back in 2000, but after 2010, the worst off have declined, and they're way down there. And we are just In other countries, we see compression actually, right? This is different scales here, so you have to take that into account. But and during the 20th century, the trend was actually compression between the better off and worse off. They were getting more similar in their life expectancy. But that all has changed in the last, 10, 15 years. But of course, the long-lived Americans are not doing so poorly. In fact, they are right in the middle of the. Notice that we're talking, this is 97 here, right? And this is 47. 97 versus 47. I mean, that's a huge difference. Okay, so why immiseration is important? Remember, that's the first of my three consequences. Immiseration for instability. Well, for the obvious reason, then immiserated people become unhappy. They lose faith in the state structures and the societal and their society they live in, and they become much more likely not just to kill themselves, but also to participate in violent acts. But by themselves, when we talk about the non-elite population, this is not enough to overthrow states. It's actually, our historical analysis shows that states are not overthrown by revolting peasants or workers or anything like that. Because as long as the state is strong, the state apparatus is strong, the police and military, and the elites are unified, they easily suppress such explosions. So back in the days of armored knights, just think about Wat Tyler rebellion in 1380, best think about Jacquerie. Jacquerie was thousands of peasants, and then like a group of 100 armored knights came and they just killed them off and drove the rest away. Today, we see those Robocops, heavily armored and armed, and of course they have no problem controlling the population. So by themselves, common people, the 90% or even the 99%, they are not a danger to the state stability. But when we start talking about the elites, that's a very different story. So who are the elites? So elites are a small percent of the population who concentrate social power in their hands. Social power comes in four basic flavors. It's coercion or military power. It's economic. It's administrative or political, where I can give you orders and you do what I tell you to do. And then the most soft and subtle power is ideological, religion or social influencers, and so on and so forth. So people who concentrate at in every branch of this power, we have people at the top, like generals and police chiefs, CEOs of 500 Fortune 500, presidents and legislatures, and thought leaders in a variety of ways. Now, you cannot say what the percentage it is, because it's a pyramid. You don't know where to cut it off. The top 10%, they have a lot of power over their own lives. The top 1% has much more power because they order other people around, and the top 1% of 1% are really powerful people at the top of all those, especially economic and political pyramids. All right. Now, so what is the effect of the wealth pump on the elites? Well, declining relative wages workers translate into increasingly larger fraction of GDP that goes to those who consume labor. First of all, economic elites, but also general elites who profit from lower wages because they are the ones who hire people. So what this means is that it results in higher rate of upward social mobility, not really biological reproductive rates, although in the past that was quite present in some societies, but mostly the high rate of upward social mobility. So think about most of the billionaires today, they're self-made people, right? They, typically, it's a CEO of a big company who retires with a golden parachute. So how did they get those billions? By paying their workers less and less, essentially. Much less than the workers produce. So that results in upward social mobility. But also, as their numbers grow, their consumption levels also grow. You have this conspicuous consumption that starts to take root. Now, you would say, okay, what's wrong with that? If you're not a Marxist, if not a flaming, leftist or something like that. I mean, this is American dream, right? I mean, that's what supposed to happen. People get rich, Elon Musk, created several great businesses and so on and so forth. All right. Some other people who did their money in banking and real estate and insurance, they're probably not quite as savory in the origins of their wealth, but it's still the American dream. Well, there are problems. Well, here you see this is very recent data from Gabriel Zucman, right, who has been agitating in France for a wealth tax on billionaires. So you can see this is pretty dramatic. I mean, here we're talking about 19 richest Americans. All right, so it goes from 0.1% to almost to 2%, essentially. This is a pretty dramatic thing, but this is just the tail of it. It's just 19 individuals. What's much more important is what happens to the next layer down. And this is where we see a pretty dramatic story. So let's look at different households by wealth, all right? So let's look at decamillionaires. So these households that have a wealth of 10 million or more in inflation-adjusted dollars. So we're keeping the threshold steady. So what we see here is back 40 years ago, there were less than 0.1%. And now they are 0.5%. So what happened that in the, actually in real, this is the proportion to population. Population has grown like 40% or so. But the numbers of decamillionaires grew tenfold. Now, you would say there is a lot of happy people out there. But there are some consequences. So first of all, as the elite numbers grow, this is especially true for pre-industrial societies. They very soon overshoot their productive base, the peasantry, and start oppressing them because there are lots of knights and priests and government officials, but the peasants are still the same number. And so they start oppressing them and extracting products from them. But in our society, the other problem is much more prevalent. The problem is this, that the number of power positions is limited. Especially this is true in the political arena. So think about it. In the United States, we have only one president, 100 senators, and so on and so forth, down to state legislatures and things like that. Now, the problem is that many of those deca-billionaires, not all, small proportion of them, they have political ambitions. So now we have 10 times as many politically ambitious, wealthy people. And that is clearly, you can see clearly this in a number of, the competition for political positions starts to heat up. So here's, for example, some data on how many so-called millionaires, people who spend at least $500,000 of their money. So you can see they have doubled, roughly speaking, from just in like 10 years or so. The cost of winning winning in elections has been growing. This is also in inflation-adjusted dollars, but that has been reported quite a lot. So these are all signs of intensifying competition for political office in the United States. So what happens is that now that we have too many aspirants, right, elite wannabes who are vying for the fixed number of positions, the number of losers starts to get out of hand. So think about it. I use the game of musical chairs to illustrate this. So you start with 10 chairs and 11 players, right? The music plays, one person gets frustrated. And then instead of removing chairs, you keep adding players. So you'll have 11 players and 12 players, 15, 20. Actually, 10 times, we have 100 players now for 10 chairs. All right, so you can imagine that on the road to this, at some point, things will start breaking down. So those surplus elites they turn into what we call counter elites, who, not all of them again, some proportion of them, and those are the ones who decide to challenge the existing order. So this is the second consequence of the wealth pump. So this was seen very clearly in elections of 2016. At that time, 17 major candidates. One of them, 17, only one chair, right? So one of them started breaking rules. It was very effective at that. And they tried to, some of them, those tried to emulate him, but he was better than that. And by the way, in 2020, there was like 22 major candidates on the Democratic side. So it's not just, all right. So, so the third consequence, I've been talking about one source of elite overproduction, which is the overproduction of wealth holders. But in the United States and other comparable countries, the dominant factions of the elites are economic and political. So wealth holders are obviously on top of the economic pyramid, power pyramid. But if you want to become a politician, you need to go the credential route. Or even if you want to get into the upper 10%, for example, of wealth distribution. The problem is that we have now huge overproduction of such elite aspirants. They're not elites; they are elite wannabes. So back in 1950s, less than 15% went into of the school graduates went into college. Now over 60. In fact, it was 66 a few years ago. It has declined since then. And so, what do you do when you have to compete with such huge number? You get an advanced degree. All right, so we can see this, the wealth premium from the bachelor's degree was declining. This is the birth cohort. So people who were born in the 1980s, they go to college in early 2000s, and they are now in the labor market. But if you want, so you have to get advanced degree, PhD, MD. But if you want to go into politics, you get what? Law degree. And so we see this here. So just let's look at this one. The number of lawyers per 1,000 population, all right, here's the integrative period. I mean, this is, we need lawyers. I mean, I have nothing against lawyers. But then suddenly, after 1970, it just exploded. Why? Because it became, this is the credential route into the elites. And really weird things happened. This is the distribution of salaries for members of the class of 20, for example, from the law school. This is really weird. You almost never see distributions like this. Typically, it looks. I lost my. Did I push the? I lost my pointer. Let's see. No. Yeah, it died. No, it's okay. It's back. Right. Usually you see, like a mode and then a long tail. But this is weird. And that's what it looked like back in the 1990s. But by 2010, suddenly this part of the peak has run away. And it's still that way. I checked the latest data for 2024. It's still like this, only the whole thing moved to the right. What this means is that this is the wonderful illustration of how intense intra-elite competition results in a smaller pool of winners and a larger pool of losers. These guys who were earning 50K, they don't even have, most of them don't even have enough income to pay off it's working now for some reason. Yeah, don't worry. They don't even have, half of them don't have enough money to pay off like $200,000 or $300,000 debts they incurred. And so this is the breeding ground for counter elites. And it turns out that Castro was a lawyer, Lenin was a lawyer, Gandhi a lawyer, Maximilian Robespierre a lawyer. Turns out that lawyers are the most dangerous profession from the point of view of the state. All right. So, so this is, and if you look at actually in the United States, the Yale Law School, that's the best breeding ground for counter elites. You know, this guy, one-eyed guy, the Oath Keepers, right? I forget his name. He was trained in Yale Law School by. Anyway, all right. I want to wrap things up because let's see. Yeah, I've got about 7 minutes. So what I want to do now is first of all emphasize that I've been hitting the highlights here. Things are human social systems are complex. So I've been talking about how immeasuration produces mass mobilization potential, and that it is by itself not enough. All right. And I was talking about how intra-elite competition, both of these are consequences of the wealth pump that produces intra-elite conflicts and the rise of the counter elites. Now, this together is an explosive combination because the mass mobilization potential provides the raw energy, right? But it needs to be organized and directed. So Trump has done precisely what many other populist politicians have done in the past. Do you know that the first populist party, in history, was actually in Rome? It was called Populares. So Gaius Gracchus and Tiberius Gracchus were the leaders of this party. So was Caesar, by the way, 2 generations later. So the populist politicians mobilize the mass mobilization potential to overthrow the established elites. Now, I didn't talk much about that, but if you are interested, obviously, in my book, I actually cover a lot of these things. This could be also important, but I don't have much time to talk about it because I want to talk a little bit about the aftermath. All right. So my good friend and co-author, Walter Scheidel, a few years ago published a very nice book. It's called The Great Leveler. So basically, death is the great leveler. He was asking somewhat different question. He was asking, how does inequality tends to grow under favorable conditions? This is sort of Piketty rule, right? But then why aren't we all, over the last 10,000 years, if that was a continuous trend, then everything would be owned by one person and we all would be immiserated. So we know that actually inequality declines. So he was asking why. And his argument is that typically it's major violent shocks, either mass mobilization for fair, transformative revolution, state failure, collapse, lethal pandemics, and things like that. So to me, inequality is not a driver. Inequality is a proxy for the twin processes of immiseration and elite overproduction, right? Inequality results because we have immiseration on one hand and elite overproduction on the other hand. But so the drivers are mass mobilization potential and intra-elite conflict, right? That's one thing. Second thing is that I'm not quite as pessimistic as Walter. So my take is that Walter is about 85 to 90% correct. But there is, we have now studied dozens, actually almost 200 past societies sliding into crisis and emerging from it. So we can now do some statistics about what are the routes. So in principle, this is what we call the ginkgo model, right? It turns out that the road to crisis is fairly channelized. It's really like a massive ball rolling down a valley, narrow valley. And it's very, it's impossible to stop it. And you cannot deflect it really. You just get smashed, all right? Unfortunately, that's the quality of dynamics. This is where all the trajectories are converging. But then once you get to the cusp of crisis, then a whole set of avenues. It's like the ball rolls now, and you can roll left, right, to better outcomes, to worse outcomes. So that's what this ginkgo leaf. All right, and so, yeah, so here's another way. The pre-crisis trajectory, collective well-being is declining, then suddenly break, there's a social pressures for crisis growing, there's a break. And then you have a whole bunch of different avenues. So what we did, we looked at, I think it's 170 societies here. So we look at the crisis and we scored them by a variety of indicators of severity. Was the population affected? Was the population collapse? Was there a lethal epidemic? What happened to the elites? What happened to the ruler, the state, and so on? So when we look at the aggregated index, basically adding up all the bad things, right? We find there's several things to find. First of all, there is like, what is it? There's like 12 or so different things. But you see that most crises have maybe between 4 and 7 of the bad consequences. So the paper we published on this is that we just stole the line from Anna Karenina that every unhappy family is unhappy in their own way. Every happy family is happy in the same way, but every unhappy family is unhappy in their own way. Every crisis is unhappy in their own way. There is always all kinds of different combinations. Now that's one thing. And really there are no cases when everything happens. Okay. But the other thing is that here at the lower level, we still see there is actually quite a bunch of cases where the severity is pretty low. So so that means this is about 10 to 15% of cases where where societies actually manage to navigate the shoals of crisis without a major revolution or bloody civil war or exterminating the elites or things like that. So some examples are the New Deal in the United States, the Chartist period in England, and a few others I discussed in my books. So just a few things. The structural demographic theory was first proposed in 1991's book by Jack Goldstone, who's very much around and part of our Cliodynamic community. He's now actually editor-in-chief of the journal Cliodynamics. So secular cycles with my Russian colleague Sergei Nefedov, we published on 8 different secular cycles in Rome, ancient Rome, medieval England, France, and early modern Russia, France, and England. This is the Ages of Discord is my technical book, which has a lot of those things. And of course, the End Times is my my trade book. So so essential general conclusions are that structural causes of end times, the ultimate one is the wealth pump. That actually drives everything, including state weakness and crumbling, right? So in past societies, usually these structural conditions usually ended up in major outbreaks. So 85 to 90% of the cases, we have really major outbreaks of political violence, right? And as I was giving this talk back in the 2010s and around 2018, 19, I would just have this thing. because it was actually kind of like, like one of those horror movies that you see the ball rolling to, in Indiana Jones, remember, the ball was rolling, and you see it, so 2010, 2014, 2017, it just keeps rolling. So it was kind of unpleasant feeling, because I live in the United States myself. All right, we are now in revolution. So I say that we are now in true revolution as of January 20 of 2025, when Trump became president. So I've written about it on my blog. Essentially, Trump is wrecking things, all right? And that's what revolutions do. In my definition, revolution is when there is, first of all, attempt to replace the ruling elites, and that's very clear. And secondly, it's the way if it's transformative evolution, it's revolution. It's to transform state institutions. So both of these are present. Fortunately, we don't have the guillotine, at least yet, right? So now you just fire all the people in USAID, all right? So that's it's dramatic, but it's better than to have your head cut off. And just a couple things to say that we are now looking at much more carefully about how societies get out of crisis. We were fortunate to get my group at Complexity Science Hub in Vienna that got a 3-year grant, which we started this year. So we'll be doing a lot of this. And, you've seen some of this, right? And a bunch of other things that I've been talking about. If you want to follow the story, I've got a Substack on which I publish at least once a week. And you can learn more about how things happen. Good, thanks, I'm finished before 7.
Thank you, Peter. You've given us a lot to think about, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sarah Walker, Deputy Director of the Beyond Center, to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you so much. I'm sure after such a smiling talk, we have tons of questions, especially given that we all want to know what's going to happen next. Who would like to ask a question? We have some mics we can pass around the room too.
So, hello. You talked about the depth. Oh, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? No? Is it on?
Check.
Check 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Okay. Hello. Okay. So, okay. So you talked a bit about the death of despair. Could you differentiate that from suicide? I didn't quite understand the differentiation between those two categories.
So they actually, the death of despair have 3 components. Suicide rate is one of them. Alcohol abuse is another one, and drug abuse is the third one. So all the argument of these two economists was that they are related, and you can see that they were sort of moving together. And even though it's despair, maybe a little bit of a misnomer, because as I said, it's mostly lack of connections and and being in a bad situation, especially economic situation. But this has been supported by recent research quite well. Actually, in addition to that, we see overall the traffic accidents have been declining, but people in this category tend to die in car accidents much more frequently than others. So it's a general social ill.
So we have a question up there. Do we have a mic that we can?
Can we go back to the slide that you have of the resilience of society, assessing resilience? You just passed it.
Just passed it. Okay.
Maybe the second to last one.
Yeah, this one.
And I wonder if we can just spend a moment with this and sort of expand out on it just a bit so we can understand what you've scaffolded here as you speak to, because you've talked about how we're in this revolution or revolution-like situation, and the kind of wrecking and the kind of grabbing of power and grabbing of assets that's going down during this destructive period. And I just want to know how that is matching up with this resilience sort of dialogue that or work that's happening here.
Yes. So let me first define resilience in terms that we use. Resilience is different from stability. Stability is simply a return to an equilibrium after perturbation. Resilience is a broader thing. When external environment changes in a way that damages function of a system, right? A resilient system will evolve, will adapt to it. So specifically for human societies, we are talking about what is the function of our societies? Ideally, the provision of broadly based well-being. All right. So when external situations change, or even internal situations change as a result of elite overproduction and mass mobilization, right? Can the system adapt to these new conditions and regain function by providing this well-being? So in a few examples, for example, such as New Deal, actually it's not just New Deal, it was about 30-year period of American history starting from the progressive era, from roughly speaking 1900 to, then that's the good movement started, and then it was sort of set in stone, well, at least until the 1970s, set in stone by the New Deal. And you saw that the effect was on well-being of American workers. Wages grew dramatically, the deaths of despair declined, was dramatic increase in life expectancy and things like that. So that system showed resiliency. But in the Civil War, United States showed lack of resilience because it was a real democracy in 1850s, right? But it could not handle the stresses of elite overproduction and mass immiseration that happened during the preceding 30 years.
So thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. I want to question your claim that we're in a revolution. It doesn't seem to me like we're in a revolution at all, that you haven't changed the elites. In fact, the same major companies that were important in 2000 are now important. Today it's the same billionaires who were operating under Biden are operating now. There are a lot of continuities between Trump's policies. Obama was the deporter in chief, and Trump he was called the deporter in chief because he deported a lot of immigrants. And Trump, of course, has intensified this. So I don't really see how this is a revolution.
Yeah. Well, first of all, what I said was more true about the first few months under Trump, when he made a big effort to overthrow essentially the established elites, right? And keep in mind that Elon Musk, who was there at the time, all right, is a counter elite in many ways. He was actually he has some chip on the shoulder because he was treated poorly by the previous administrations, and his goal with Doge was to actually clean house. That was unsuccessful, mostly unsuccessful. But he is part of that counter-elite culture according to my definitions. Now, to give you a perspective, we live day by day. But when you look at history, things happen much more slowly than you think. The French Revolution took 10 years between Bastille and the coming of Napoleon, right? So we've just been 1 year into this. And French Revolution went back and forth, and there were the first a bunch of counteries who came to power were guillotined. Then the next one was also guillotined. Then they all got overthrown by Napoleon. So now, in my view, Trump is mismanaging things so much that they will be out. Who knows when? 2026 or 2028, right? Then we'll have another. So typically, what happens is that those people who come to power, they don't really know what to do in most cases, all right? And so they try different things. You know, the French Revolution, if you look about it, think about it, it's just the first 10 years, but actually the age of revolution in France went from 1789 to 1870, the Paris Commune. It took 80 years. And there was one revolution after every 15 years, they had a revolution or something like that. They were trying to figure things out. Finally, after 1870, they figured things out. They had the Belle Epoque. The worker wages shot and the well-being just went through the roof. And they had a great thing going, even despite World War I, things like that. But it took them 3 generations to figure it out. And so unfortunately, hopefully for us, it will take less time because that's what this grant is about. So maybe I didn't. So our question is not only how societies lose that resilience, but how do they regain it? All right. And so that I've been talking about structural variables 99% of the time here. But in fact, once the ball gets to that cusp, our working hypothesis is that this is where the leaders, and especially their networks, support networks, can push the ball in either good or bad direction. And so because trajectories are diverging at that point, it's very sensitive dependence. And so on one hand, it's good because individual actions can actually change things. But on the other hand, it's very hard to study scientifically. That's why we need hundreds of cases to do good statistics. And that's what this grant is about. And also in this grant, we will attempt to replicate the prediction for United States, which I did 16 years ago for 12 countries. We'll publish the predictions and wait 10 years and see how that works out. And I fully expect that after time we'll be very wrong. But that's the whole point of doing research, to learn new things.
Yeah, so you talk about how the wealth pump can increase how many elites there are and increase competition among elites, which motivates some counter elites to try to destabilize the system, to acquire more resources for themselves in order to sustain themselves. And I was just hoping that you could maybe give some more clarity on what exactly these resources are, because like on an individual level, it doesn't seem really prudent to like it doesn't seem like the best way to maximize personal wealth is to like go up against an establishment, right? And it seems like that anyone who's in a position to meaningfully disrupt the establishment would already have enough personal resources such that, you know, like wealth, I don't know, it's hard for me to imagine would be the primary motivation. And so, you know, these individuals who are running up against the establishment, the counter elites, in what sense are they motivated by resources exactly?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I gave you too much of a rational agent explanation for counter elites. But in fact, the proximate factors are typically not, I mean, there is a saying in Russian that a successful revolution means 10,000, positions, right? And that's true. And so some people probably are motivated by that. But when you start studying their lives as revolutionaries or even failed revolutionaries, for example, it's very useful to read the memoirs of the weather underground. All right, they were not trying to feather their nest. They typically came from pretty good upper middle class positions and things like that. No, they were motivated by rage. So if you look at those people like Lenin and Castro, they all came from pretty. Lenin was a nobleman, actually, and he owned land with peasants. So the peasants were free at the time. Castro came from a very wealthy family, all right, and so on and so forth. So what happens is that the conditions that huge growth of disparities, of inequality, and suffering of the majority of the population, immiseration of the majority of the population, they provide the ideological fuel for attempts to overthrow the state. So most revolutionaries actually start, not most, because some of them are quite instrumental and very rational, but most of them are driven by their huge sense of injustice. Now, once they get into power, things again start changing, but their ability to self-sacrifice. So we know, for example, that humans are quite heterogeneous as agents. So we have maybe typical, if you do play the public goods game here for these people, you'll find that 25% plus minus are rational agents. They will not contribute to public goods game unless they are punished, right? Then another 20%, they are pure altruists. They will always keep contributing even though when things. And then there is that 50 to 60% are moralistic punishers. These are conditional cooperators. And so they will actually spend their own money to punish free riders. And we know actually their motivations very well because clever experimentalists stuck them into the brain scanning things. And they found that when they start punishing, which part of their brain lights up, they get really incensed, all right? And they get their sense of justice gets completely activated, and they're willing to pay a lot to punish things. So think about this is a good model for many of the radical counter elites.
So I think we might have time for one last question, and then we'll leave it at that. So we have a very enthusiastic hand up in the back, and we want to try to get some students. So we'll, can you, all the way in the back, Jessica, way up there, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Trying to get some more students to get opportunities to ask questions.
Is this thing on? Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so do you think that, because you mentioned the wealthy elite having like sorts of like four sources of power, whether it's like administrative, political, military, and then you mentioned like a more soft, subtle power, which was like influence, religion, radical ideology. So throughout history, we've had there have been like in many parts of societies all across the world, you've had elites who exerted a lot of religious influence and cultural influence that impacts society, whether it was geopolitically, culturally, or economically. Do you think that in those certain cases, whether it was like, during the times of ancient Sumeria or Rome, or even like medieval Europe or ancient China, that these religious elites or elites that might use religion, they would look at like, environmental changes, whether it was like a natural disaster or celestial changes like a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse, and, use those examples and those interpretations as a means to justify either economic concentration of power or geopolitical changes like going to war or changes in government, that sort of thing.
So yeah, this is a very good question. So one thing I didn't mention is that the structural demographic model, when we apply it to any particular society, we have to tailor it because different societies have different sources of power that tend to be emphasized. So in my book, in Times, I argue that the United States is a plutocracy. The main source of power is wealth, but although it works with collaboration with political elites, and wealth completely dominates both the ideological through ownings of newspapers and so on and so forth, and military power. All right. So, for example, generals get pushy positions in companies after they retire. Right, but that's different. So if you look at Iran, for example, Iran is one of the rare examples today where the elites, the reigning elite is ideological elite. But essentially, they are all susceptible to the same problems of elite overproduction, right? Even when Christian religious leaders try to control the population by not allowing to have children, right? They still had nepots and so on and so forth. So elites always find a way to overproduce themselves. Now, as to your other question, which is sort of separate, using natural disasters as a way. Well, that is actually not just religious elites. In fact, that could be used against religious elites. So back in China, famines or huge natural disasters would put in question the mandate of heaven. And something like this we had happen in 2020 when COVID came. It really delegitimized our United States government because their response was just so pathetic, all right? So these natural disasters, they can be used by any kind of counter elites, not just religious ones. Astronomical. Predictable astronomical events like in Maya calendar and so on, they were used by elites to legitimize themselves because they could predict the, you know that the rains will come eventually. You start praying and suddenly the rains come. And so that, but that's not a big route to legitimation, actually. It just happens in some societies.
So let's thank our speaker. I think all of us will think about the patterns in history quite differently and have some books to read. And thank you all for coming out tonight and joining us for the Beyond annual lecture. Appreciate seeing you all. Thank you.
And thank you all for listening and asking great questions.
That was excellent. Thank you so much. That was great. Yep.
You too. Thank you so much for your help.
Right. Let's disconnect by.
Yeah, 1 second here.
Take your time.